We're going to now go on to our third speaker for the day, Nada Raza, who's joining us over Skype. Do you hear me well? Yeah, great. So Nada has been researching extensively in South Asia. So she's a great friend also of Experimenter, and unfortunately on this particular occasion hasn't been able to join in person, but her research within India continues from a distance, and in fact in depth also into cities beyond the capital and Bombay, etc., in Ahmedabad, in many other spaces. And I mean, this is something that perhaps we can also address with Nada on the scope of her current research. She is currently at the Tate Research Center Asia as research curator, and has been at the Tate for some years now, previously as assistant curator from 2012 onwards, and has contributed to Meshak Gaba Museum of Contemporary African Art in 2013, and has also curated the collection of displays of work by Munir Sharudi, Farmian, and Zarina Hashmi, and also Sheila Gowda, which is an exhibit that I have seen, and it's fantastic in the way that it has also been contextualized within the collection of the Tate. And further, she's contributed a thematic exhibition to the Dhaka Art Summit, which she will be addressing today, and has been curator of the Abraj Capital Art Prize in 2014. Further, of course, sorry to forget, the very large survey of Bhupen Khakkar, You Can't Please All, at Tate Modern, which also traveled to Deutsche Bank Kunsthalle, and that is another project that Nada will be sharing with us, and perhaps it's interesting for those who came yesterday to also consider in the way that Rubina has worked extensively with Nasreen, and the work has traveled in India and abroad through this endeavor, and what it means to work with another very loved artist from Baroda in the way that Nada and her colleague and Chris Durkon and other colleagues have done at the Tate through their research. Welcome, Nada.
Hi, and thank you, Natasha and Experimenter, for inviting me. Can you all hear me clearly? Yes. Great. I'm sorry I'm not there in person. I'll be honest about the reason. I'm family in town in London at the moment. South Asia is here at the moment. I wanted to just talk a bit generally about the exhibition before launching into the presentations, but I will talk about Bhupen Khakkar first. I can hear an echo. Better now? Good? Okay, excellent. Okay, so it's been interesting preparing for this presentation because I worked on these exhibitions simultaneously. Both happened in 2016. And in order to really be able to manage that, I had sort of thought of them as very separate, disparate projects. But actually, while looking back at them, I realized that there were both similarities in method and also in the curatorial strategies of display. I think what is common in both is that there's a strong narrative arc, that there is a very formal structure, and that there is a lot of literary and textual reference. And both exhibitions happened within the context of larger institutional structures. So the Khakkar exhibition was happening at the Tate Modern in the lead up to the opening of our new building. And therefore, this quite modest 5-room exhibition was, surrounded by this sort of major moment in the institution's history, while the Dhaka exhibition was happening within the context of the 4-day Dhaka Art Summit, which again has this sort of almost fairground quality, And so what I really tried to do in both the exhibitions was create an internal logic and an internal structure so that when you entered the space of the exhibition, you really had to sort of forget what was outside and enter into its world. Um, so I will start with the Bhupen Thakkar exhibition. And if you could go now to the first slide in the presentation, and I'll just keep speaking over it. So I've called this presentation Getting to Know Bhupen because really the research process for the exhibition, sorry, could you move I can't see the screen. Is it possible to move the computer so that I can see what you're seeing? Okay, perfect. Yeah, so if you could just stay on that. Yeah, perfect. So my journey with Bhupen really began when I was assigned this exhibition at the Tate Modern in 2014. And, you know, he was an artist I'd heard of, but I'll be honest, unlike Rubina's relationship with Nasreen, I really had to start from scratch here. And it was almost sort of, you know, it was a really extraordinary journey for me because I really had to start at the beginning. And somehow I feel like there was some kind of guiding hand because while I was working on the show, I lost two curators, one museum director, one catalog editor, one administrator. And by the end, it was sort of just me holding on to this project. And people came along that sort of, you know, opened up vistas, which really led to the exhibition becoming possible. And it started with me meeting Bhupen's childhood best friend, Sunil Kothari, in a coffee shop in the West Village. And him giving me this really long list of names and places and people that I should go and talk to. Um, and I think we can press play on the presentation now. I think, is it on? So just so you guys know, the presentations are just going to roll on their own and I'll keep talking over them. So we may not be perfectly synced up, but we can go back and forth a little bit. Maybe we can, yeah, there we go. So as I discovered, there were many, many, many faces of Bhupen Thakkar. Every single person close to him I spoke to, starting with artists such as Ghulam Sheikh, Geeta Kapoor, and so on, you know, gave me a different version of the story. And so the title of the show, You Can't Please All, which is also the title of the Tate work, really came from my knowing that you know, the version we were going to come up with would also be imperfect and incomplete. And so these are the places where the research happened. And if you could just go back one slide. And I really set out to say that Bhupen was not a discovery for the museum, that he was a familiar figure, that this was his fourth outing at the museum. So he'd been part of Six Indian Painters, which was a show that Hodgkin curated so around the time of the Triennial of India, where he first met Bhupen Thakkar. And that was really the introduction of the London art world to the artist. And Bhupen returned to the UK many times. And then again at Century City in the section on Bombay, curated by Geeta Kapoor. And around the time of his death, he was in an exhibition at Tate Liverpool and also part of other exhibitions in the UK that were really dealing with figuration. What was extraordinary for me was that in these years, in just a decade, while you know the Indian art market and the Indian art world had really moved on, somehow after his death, Bhupen had slightly been left behind, and there are many reasons for this. Some of these are logistical reasons. A lot of the work that was in the estate was with trustees, and there had been no real possibility of showing the work in India. And I'm really glad that through Tate's interest in the show, the NGMA was able to access the estate, and an exhibition and a symposium happened in Delhi. If we can play or go to the next slide. So as I was saying, with the research, I started with New York, and I really sort of uncovered every stone. You can let it play, um, and you know spent some time traveling to Ahmedabad, Baroda, Surat. We did a symposium in Delhi where a lot of the people we had spoken to were invited to come and speak publicly, just to make sure that that we were really capturing that information before the show opened in London in June. The show was divided into 5 parts, 5 rooms, and the titles of each room were really taken from language produced by Bhupan himself. So one way of bringing his personality in was to use his language. He was a writer. He wrote a play. He was a real raconteur. He was really strongly embedded in this Gujarati sensibility, especially humor, and I really wanted that to be part of the exhibition. So the exhibition is broadly chronological. It started with his early work, his progression as an artist. So this second section, the title is taken from a chapter in Timothy Hyman's book. I was constantly acknowledging those who had come before me and had already done some work. This formal logic was also informed by my visit to Bhupan's house in Baroda. And so we tried to recreate that somewhat in the space of the exhibition. So you had a backdrop off the studio, and on that we played Judy Marl's 1983 film, Messages from Bhupan Khakkar, which was really a collaboration with the artist. So not only did you have this kind of color that I had taken from the interior of his house, but you also had his voice in the space of the exhibition through that film. If you could go back one slide. So I really wanted to show a clear progression in the work. And we tried to make groupings within that chronology that could show the relationships between different paintings and different moments. And this, for me, was a particularly successful grouping where we were able to show the work Man in Pub from the Trade series and Man with a Bouquet of Plastic Flowers, both dealing with the kind of alienated male subject. Bhupan was very interested in this sort of working class figure who, and this is at a time when India is transforming, and this kind of, he was very interested in not just kitsch, but what he called bad taste or vulgar taste. So he's showing this man holding this bouquet of plastic flowers, which he says will live forever, in his polyester shirt, surrounded by the sort of suburban space, but in some ways, faced with a kind of pathos, which you can see in his eyes. And similarly, Man in Pub is his response to having spent some time in England, which he found, gray, dreary, alienating, and he observed these figures because he would be in these social spaces, especially the pub, and I love the way that he captured that 80s London environment with that very particular patterned carpet in the background. There's a lot of detail, a lot of rich detail in these paintings. And he uses the vignettes in the background to tell the story of this man. And it's this real storyteller's sensibility that I wanted to capture, and for me became a way to tell his story in the show. I had to learn about pre-Renaissance painting, Pichwai painting, Nathwara. I knew a little bit about miniature, but the extremely rich set of references in his own imagination that he brought into the work, everything that he was, he did a degree in art criticism as he began to develop a painterly language. And it was really challenging for us to be able to translate that into an exhibition format in a public institution. And we can talk about this a bit more on how the sort of onus on us is to make things publicly accessible to all. And therefore, the language that is used, the lengths of the wall text, all of that is very heavily prescribed. So we had to sort of find ways of making the exhibition interesting both to a completely new audience, but yet not oversimplified for a knowledgeable audience. If you could keep the PowerPoint going, thank you. So Good Taste Can Be Very Killing was a title taken from one of the slides in the film. And as I said, he'd really kind of intervened in this process. The film is on YouTube, and I can send you guys a link if anybody wants to see it. This third room was really the core of the exhibition. It was the biggest space, and so You Can't Please All had a prominent position. What we were really doing in this room was showing the range of the practice, so bringing in not just the paintings that he's best known for, but also accordion books, ceramics. If you could go back a slide. And these incredibly luminous, beautiful watercolors, which I think for me were the biggest discovery research-wise in the exhibition. There is a point at which Bhupen's eyesight was affected, and he started making these sort of large, blurry paintings in which he was able to be a bit more transgressive in terms of what the figures were engaged in. And so there, those are kind of really sort of lush, very expressive paintings. But the watercolors, on the other hand, are extremely precise and have this very translucent, really beautiful quality. If you can keep going, I think I have some close-ups of them. He also did a few large panoramic canvases, again, really inspired by both Nathwara and Sienese painting, which the most, I guess, well-known of those is Celebration of Guru Jayanti, which is a famous lost painting. And, during the course of this research, there were many things I couldn't bring in here, which I would love to share later on. Here are some of those watercolors I was speaking about. We also had a lot of material in vitrines, which brought in the literary output as much as we could. So here is a collaboration he did with Salman Rushdie, where he illustrated some of his stories. Some spreads, if we could go back a slide. Spreads from Vrishchik, which is a really important magazine that Ghulam Sheikh and Bhupen brought out together. A poster from a play that he staged where he painted the sets himself. Early catalogs, correspondence. It was, again, his sense of humor was something that kept coming up in the conversations that I was having with his friends and colleagues. He was sort of a prankster, and it was a kind of sharp sense of humor, which was often very critical of what was going on around him. So there was a letter in this vitrine where he spoke of his impressions again of the UK, which we thought was important to bring in. It was important to place him as someone who was a cosmopolitan international character, even at that time, and was, that kind of colonial relationship to London was already, by that generation of artists, being dismantled. They were already speaking back to the colony. And it's interesting, I moved to London in 2005, and at that time, there had been a sort of break. There hadn't been Indian survey exhibitions for a while, and we started working on South Asia in a really sustained way at the Tate as late as 2012. So in terms of research, it was very interesting for me to go back and look at these materials. If you can keep going. So here, this is the fourth room of the exhibition where we really dealt with the tenderness of his relationships. he came out of the closet in the 80s, and he came out also in his work. And that is really what is most radical about Bhupen. And what is really interesting also is to understand that at the time he was making these works, he was sort of in his studio in Baroda, out in the open, and it was sort of spoken or unspoken. The work was accepted, it was seen, it was received. It's only later on when he wants to become more public that people become nervous about showing the work. Maybe we can talk about that in the questions. When Bhupen is at his sort of, strongest, best, most expressive, he was struck with prostate cancer. And it is here where the humor and also his relationship with the grotesque, with kind of dealing with horror, become extremely powerful. It's also a very violent time in Gujarat. And even though his friends had told me Bhupen was not political, I was, happy to find that he had addressed that moment of rupture in the practice. But again, also dealt with the internal bodily pain that he was suffering through this kind of extremely dark sense of humor. And the show concluded with a painting which was one of the first that I had seen, which I think was one of the most important paintings in the show, which is called The Idiot, which is this small, really luminous, beautiful work on paper. Which shows this man who is in the state of complete abject physical degradation, and is being laughed at, but even within that is trying to smile through that pain. The exhibition, we can keep going. As I said, there were the kind of art historical challenge of dealing with a practice with such a wide range of references, meant that we had to deal with a lot of the detail in the publication. So in the catalog, we invited people to respond to specific works based on their specific knowledge of the practice. There was a huge amount of archival research, which is also in the publication. And what it made evident to me was, this amazing community that Bhupen belonged to, and that community we tried to bring in both into the exhibition, but also kind of will continue to inform our research on India, particularly on Baroda, moving forward. You can just keep it going. And I just wanted to share some of these images with you because I so enjoyed getting to know the past through them. And people were incredibly generous with us. Even till the end, I was receiving images that I wasn't able to include. And so, it was really through this contextual material that I feel like I was able to get to know him as much as possible posthumously. The exhibition, as Natasha mentioned, traveled to the Deutsche Bank Kunsthalle. It's a smaller space there, even smaller than Tate, which I had sort of crammed as much as possible. There were some differences, and it was interesting, and we can talk about this. I just wanted to show you a few images of the work that we had expected some kind of response to the very strong sexual imagery in the show in London, and expected Berlin to be more permissive. But in fact, it was in Berlin that people felt that some of these images, especially for children, would be too strong. So it was also interesting to see where we could push and where we couldn't, how you kind of work with certain types of material in a public context, but also how much you can push the boundaries of what an institution thinks that it can do. I will very quickly move on to the next exhibition. I just wanted to also just say something about the color blue that I have chosen to also wear today. In the Khakkar exhibition, that choice of color was very much about my entering his space, and to me, it was the accountant's blue. Bhupen was trained as an accountant and worked as an accountant by day. And for me, that was that sort of ink pen, carbon paper blue, which sort of helped me again create that atmosphere that differentiated. Could we just pause this for a minute? Thank you. That differentiated the exhibition space from the space outside. Similarly, in Dhaka, the brief that I was given within the exhibition format, and the Dhaka Art Summit, for those of you who don't know, it's going to be longer this time, but last year was a 4-day exhibition, really focused on South Asia. I'm going to go a little bit over, please forgive me. It is really hard because these were both such massive projects. But I can do this in 10 minutes. And so the research for me, the invitation was to produce an exhibition of emerging artists from South Asia. And I did do that, but I strayed as much as possible from that and tried to complicate it by making the show both intergenerational and also expanding the definition of who is South Asian. When I arrived in Dhaka for my early research trips, what I found was, again, this kind of, and I guess that's also my way of getting to know a place, is to start thinking about literature. And it was interesting for me, as someone who had grown up with a healthy appetite for sci-fi, to see that sci-fi was a genre that was very popular in this part of the world. So I had arrived with, I guess, ideas about what I might do, but that very quickly shifted from the artists and the works that I saw when I was in Bangladesh. And this work that really became the cornerstone of the exhibition is a painting by Gaganendranath Tagore, and we can let the slideshow play. Can we just start from the top? Perfect. Which really, for me, and this painting is called Resurrection, became the starting point. If you could just go back. Thank you. For the exhibition. And it's a work that is probably from the 20s and is really, for me, became incredibly enigmatic, because at the center of the painting, in this kind of sky blue vortex, is a saint-like figure and a cross. And at the back of the work, there's an inscription from the Bible that says, "I will be with you always, even until the end of time." So in this painting is this sort of futuristic vortex, but at the same time, there's this real spiritual question. And that really is what the exhibition was also trying to do. It was trying to look at that moment in Bengal in the 1920s, which is, that turn of the century moment has been called the Bengal Renaissance, when there was a real intellectual investigation of what it meant to be modern in South Asia. And I was trying to start from there and look back through the lens of the present to see where we've come today in terms of addressing the same questions. You can let the slideshow play. And so the title of the show came from The Story of the Missing One, which is by J.C. Bose. It's one of the early sci-fi stories from the region. The exhibition also moved in 4 parts. It was very structured. It brought you into a space that would sort of seduce you, very gentle, very minimalist. It was about enchantment. The section is called Staring Up at the Sky. And I was trying to create this sense of wonder through contemporary practice, really bringing together works that I had come across over my curatorial research in South Asia for 10 years. Sound was very important to the show. So in this space, there was a soundtrack of a video by Rohini Devashar. So you would hear birds chirping. So it really created this atmosphere. And from this, I have to confess, I resisted the short exhibition text I was doing for Khakkar by doing very long exhibition texts in Dhaka. But I also was conscious that people may not read them, so the works in the exhibition had to be sort of accessible enough and visually compelling enough for you to move through it regardless. There were sort of these specters that were haunting the exhibition. So there was the figure of J.C. Bose, this sort of scientist who believed in sentient life. of plants. There was Abdus Salam, the Pakistani physician, who was quite a spiritual man. He was Ahmadi. There was Arthur C. Clarke, the sci-fi writer who moves to Sri Lanka. Uh, uh, Ruqayya Sakhawat Hussain, who wrote Sultana's Dream, which was an early feminist story from the region. So I was reading and thinking about all of these figures. So that work by Mary Murtaza is a tribute to Abdus Salam, part of a larger body of work. And the second movement in the exhibition then became this idea of alienation. And here I brought in artists who had either traveled and felt displaced, or were living in South Asia and sort of seeing it in these sort of not quite alienated, but definitely in these estranged ways. So this is work by an artist from Sri Lanka made while he was at the Rijksacademy. And I won't go into detail of each one. I'll just kind of speak generally about these moments. Work that really was looking at the violent political history of the region. Works by David Aylesworth, made while he was living in Karachi, by Saskia Pantalon, who is a Belgian artist in her 80s living in Sri Lanka. And here, I really wanted to think about alienation, I guess, as a modern or a contemporary phenomena, thinking through ideas about secular enchantment and the alienation caused by capitalism that I had been discussing through the work of the philosopher. I should claim here, I was privy to this because he's my uncle, but Akhil Bilgrami's work has really dealt with asking these questions. And somehow, subconsciously, those conversations started entering this exhibition in what was happening in South Asia at that time. And we were really, in Dhaka at that time, this conversation about the bloggers was very live. I was aware that I couldn't speak about it, like if I spoke about it too directly, that it would be, hitting people over the head, but I wanted to create a space where those questions might be raised. The third movement in the exhibition, and I was also thinking very clearly about who the audience was here. I had been to the summit before, and I had seen that there was a huge number of school children that passed through the galleries. I mean, the summit is an extremely public event, and I wanted to bring in works that would kind of visually also appeal to a much wider demographic. And so I invited Iftikhar and Elizabeth Dadi to remake a work that they had done for the Queen's Museum, which is the Magic Carpet. And this was one of the sort of centerpieces of the exhibition, alongside a work by a young artist from Chittagong, Zihan Karim. And Zihan's video, which was projected on this convex surface, the eye, was another sort of focal point. And this work deals really with this very bucolic landscape that turns into this apocalyptic space. And this also had this very melodic, very seductive soundtrack that kind of led you into the final closing sort of chapter of the exhibition. And the movement was from light to dark, from heaven to hell, from this kind of inviting space to a more apocalyptic landscape. These works by Feroz Mahmood were dealing with garment workers, but also factory owners, so Dream, which are looking at, again, this kind of aspirational, these portraits of these aspirational workers, but done through these very futuristic looking glasses that he works with his subjects to produce. So very, very staged portraits, which led into the video by Tejal Shah. And this is, again, early work that she had done at Documenta, but we showed a section of these videos, which are of these figures in a almost like a post-apocalyptic landscape, but they're they're sort of human insect quality. And of course, what has been happening in terms of exhibitions dealing with the Anthropocene were something I was aware of. But again, I didn't want to be too heavy-handed. I wanted it to be just a bit more magical. So certain things get repeated in the exhibition. So this image of the moon is something that recurs. This is a video by Sahej Rahal. Again, it feels like a crescent, but it's a slowly moving, almost breathing terracotta Ganesh. And I ended the exhibition with this work by a very young artist from Dhaka who was studying in London at the time. And you end on this sort of line of the horizon, but also this red moon. And I ended with a quote from this. Could we go back just one slide? I'm almost done. With an almost redemptive quotation from this book, which I found on my own bookshelf. I guess my dad had this book from the 70s, but it was written in 1952. And I thought it was a really extraordinary provocation for solidarity today, considering the really fraught context in which we all work, which again, I hope we can talk about a bit in the discussion. But even sort of bringing this exhibition to a head, I couldn't help but introduce some something that kind of invited people to think about how we might save the world. If you can move to the next slide. The exhibition and Dhaka, like I said, was extraordinary simply about the number of people that saw the exhibition. And we had poets from Dhaka perform within the exhibition. And what was really extraordinary for me was the afterlife of the exhibition in terms of social media. And I think it's something as curators that we should really start thinking about. And, our documentation, we always struggle with how to document an exhibition. And it was really interesting for me to see that, that I had actually thought about photogenic works, and that kind of played out. This was a headline while I was in Bangladesh. And similarly to the London exhibition, the Dhaka exhibition, I was very pleased, was invited to come to Norway. So it also had an afterlife. It went to Oka, where the audience was very different. And it was really interesting for me to reconfigure the exhibition with the same works and the same artists. And I was thinking about that as Hamad was speaking about Lines of Control, that that was an exhibition that I worked on very early in my career, and there are things that happen when you're making an exhibition for the first time that really get distilled when you look at it the second time round, and it's been really great for me to actually this process last year was so nonstop for me that today really feels like the first time that I've been able to sit back and think about these shows. I'll stop there.
Thanks so much, Nada. Perhaps we could take up this question that we discussed of what it means for an exhibition to travel across different kinds of institutions. So from London to Berlin, from Dhaka to Oslo, the kind of accompanying, not just the in-depth publications that you have worked on each time, but also the kind of programming that took place in order to translate as well some of these more intimate kind of truths of the artist. In the case of Upen, the neighborhood around the house, this was some of the things we also tried to bring up in Berlin in the conversation with Devika, the trade series. In fact, his quite political painting in comment with the Bangladesh, in the essay that she wrote about. So maybe to chart that out for the audience.
Sure. immediately seemed a very foreign visual language. And it was amazing for me while I was doing the tours to see the moment when the penny dropped. So we did a lot of curator-led tours where I would talk people through the exhibition and in each kind of choose a few works to highlight. Um, I guess a challenge for us when we're working with exhibitions of South Asian or West Asian or African art is how much context do you provide? How much ethnographic, uh, geographic information should you be compelled to give? And of course, my immediate response was, I don't want to do that. People can Google it. Like in this day and age, do I still really have to do that? And I think those tensions will take time to resolve. I think the more that these exhibitions happen, uh, the more these questions can be addressed. There'll never be a perfect way, but we can certainly um, shed some of this baggage. Um, I think in terms of inviting other people in to speak, what we did here was a panel discussion where we had Geeta Kapoor, Deepak Anand, Karin Zitzevitz, and Sonal Kolar come and speak about different aspects of the exhibition. And that was alongside a conference on London Asia that happened at the Paul Mellon Center. And that was really the moment when I had a sort of expert South Asian audience in the house. And for me, again, of course, there's a general audience, but the audience I was really worried about were the people who knew the work and whether for them this exhibition was really producing something new. That's what I really cared about. I'll bring this up myself because I know it's a question everyone must have, is that there was a Guardian review. And of course, this was my first exhibition. I was working with Chris Decaux on it. It was a really, big moment for me. And the Guardian is a newspaper that I read. And I think more than me, he was upset about it. And I realized that actually the debate that this review was bringing up about the Indian body and Indian figuration was such an old debate. It was kind of unbelievable that we were talking about the same tropes that Pata Mitter had tried to address in Much Maligned Monsters again today. It's like, really, do I really have to do this all over again? What was really heartening, though, was the Indian response to that review. Like, I didn't actually even have to do anything. The way in which people who hadn't even seen the exhibition were up in arms about
I
about
actually
that
have, I've
was
written
quite
a short
extraordinary.
quote, Nada, from Geeta's
Sorry?
response. I've written a short, taken an excerpt from Geeta's response to that
Yeah,
review. And I was just,
yeah,
I wanted to actually bring that up also because, if you'd allow me, because
sure.
what I appreciated, I mean, and there were also, people who said, what can't we take a poor a kind of a negative review on Bhupen? Do we have to become combative, or do we have to immediately use our sort
Yeah,
of media to negate that? At the same
yeah,
time, and this is the reason to read this short excerpt, because what I appreciated was that it wasn't words in defense. It was
yeah,
actually a way of continuing the thinking around the work and around its
yeah,
presentation for an audience as well in the country that wouldn't have the chance to see this exhibition. And that
sure.
again, as part of the critic's role, I found quite phenomenal to kind of course, support your efforts over years to have realized it, and for Bhupen to once again be seen at this scale and this depth. But
Yeah,
yeah, so just to read, she writes, over the years, I have written repeatedly on Kakar and tried always to tilt the argument so that each trajectory opens a new perspective. A retrospective at this moment, and brackets always inevitably incomplete because of the difficulty with loans, the condition of paintings, and other factors. will reveal the scale of Bhupen's oeuvre, from the intimate to the enchanted to the vastly social, the ironic to the desperately confessional. At the very least, it should raise a question shaped by a deeper human sensibility that feeds the aesthetic. How many contemporary artists can make the language of painting offer the gift of a complex vernacular and vivid speech to their beloved subjects? This was the conclusion of a short piece, and I just felt that there's so many points that are made just in this one paragraph for us to consider. So, just to kind of, share.
No, thank you for that. And that's a really well selected excerpt. And, I mean, again, that was one of the major challenges of the show, is how can I say it any better than it has already been said? What can we offer that is new? And I think what I did manage to do by doing such deep research is unearth works that had gone astray. I mean, there were, for instance, the work Wall Woman Masjid, which is clearly referencing Ayodhya, was a work that had been misdated. So once I had high resolution images of all the works, I actually sat down with Gujarati numerals and retranslated, because Bhupen always dated his work. He was an accountant, so he wrote the day, date, and year on every work. And so I had to translate from Gujarati, and I found that a lot of them, not a lot of them actually, but a couple of them had been mistranslated because they'd been read as Hindi. So we were able to correct dates. And so Wall Woman Masjid hadn't been considered in that light. It was in the Deutsche Bank's collection, so it hadn't been seen for ages. But it had been dated a lot earlier, but I was able to establish that it was painted sort of in response. There were works, the ceramics, for instance, which were in a private collection in Delhi. Of course, we had access to the works that were in the estate, that were in Surat, but there were works in Paris, in New York, in Geneva, in storage. There were many works that we couldn't borrow because Bhupen, having kind of devised his own painting techniques, would paint often wet on wet, and so the works haven't aged very well. There was a huge kind of conservation question that came up while I was working on this exhibition, which again is what complicates often in the ability of the Western institution to really mount these exhibitions. If the work isn't in a public collection, and if we can't sort of get that institutional support, it becomes extremely difficult and very expensive for these works to travel. The logistical sort of challenges involved with sort of setting up partnerships with the Ministry of Culture, with the NGMA, and with the private lenders is a huge story just in and of itself. And I'm really pleased that we were able to do it. I think what it's done is really established to Tate that it can be done, that it's not impossible.
Thank you. We're going to take questions from the audience. So please ask away. Anything? Okay.
Hi, Nada.
Hi.
When we were talking about Bhupen's show, and you said there was a major part of the exhibition that you would like to show and you weren't able to. So it's a more generic question, not necessarily just for Bhupen, but so when there is this very historically relevant material that you have to show in order to understand an artist's practice, and especially when you are loaning works, and there are only certain works that you can loan and certain that you can't, then how do you bridge that gap or fill the void? And what do you do in that format? Because when we walked around Bhupen's show, there were parts that one could imagine if you had access, and if you could, you would possibly show certain other works as well. So what would your role be in that case?
From a practical point of view, it was probably a blessing because Tate had initially given me 4 rooms. I managed to fight for 5, or we managed to fight for 5. Um, and that was also because this new building was opening at that time, and the institution really wanted to show how much we had done with the international collection. So all the works that we've been acquiring in the 5 years that Reem last visited needed to go on display. So so I was also sort of, but I also really wanted this exhibition to happen simultaneously with that for a historic reason, that Bhupen was in the building when Tate Modern launched with Century City. So there's a really nice kind of return for him to be back in the building when the new wing opened. I really wanted to harness that moment for him. To really answer your question, again, there will always be absences. Uh, I think what you do is you find the kind of next best alternative. The part that's missing from the exhibition is work that I think needs to happen in India. I don't think it can necessarily happen in South Asia because that is the very rich Gujarati side to the practice. I mean, Bhupen wrote in Gujarati, the work were translated into English. There's a huge amount of correspondence, letters that he wrote, some in English, some in Gujarati, to all of his friends, to people, Amit Ambalal that I met in Baroda, people I met in Bombay, people from the literary world. He was part of this literary circle that he and Ghulam belonged to, that Atul Dodia, in fact, told me a lot about. So his correspondence with them, which is extremely insightful and again shows this extremely sharp intellect and also very, pointed wit. He was a bit of a trickster. It also shows his kind of imagination in that I was told that he had, he was playing at being heterosexual until he came out of the closet. So he had an imaginary wife. He was living in a very heteronormative Baroda. So he had an imaginary wife and 2 good-for-nothing children who were bootleggers. But his imaginary wife was having affairs with his real friends, And so this was an ongoing joke. Apparently, he would play act even if he was in a train with a group of people going somewhere. And these guys, they did so much together, from Kasauli to going to Banaras, all these artist camps. There's a whole history of this community of artists that can be told through this correspondence, through his drawings, his sketchbooks. It could be called ephemera, but I also think it is a sort of archival history. I have to thank, again, like I said, there was a lot of serendipity that happened. I have to thank the Asia Art Archive and the work that Hamad and Sabi were doing, because as I needed things, they were digitizing them, because they'd been working with Vivan and Geeta's archives and also Ghulam's archives. So it was really good timing that material became accessible kind of simultaneously. Yeah.
What I try to say that, not in the global context, but, in the Western context, there's a definite definition of being, the other. And in India at that point of time, sort of the space was very ambiguous, whereas in the West it's sort of very structured. It's very defined. Here it's sort of not accepted yet accepted, and accepted yet not accepted. So that's sort of the point of time when Bhupen worked. So as a curator, was it at the back of your mind when you were presenting, the case of Bhupen, not just as a painter, but also someone who's reflecting on the otherness?
I only heard the second part of the question. Could you just tell me the phrase that you mentioned at the beginning? Okay. So that's really, actually, it's a great question, because yesterday was the 50th anniversary of homosexuality being legalized in the UK. When Bhupen comes to England in the 80s that his friend Howard, who he's living with, is going through that process. And Bhupan sort of meets people at that stage who are really confronting, what it means to go from being a sort of subculture and being hidden to being public. And it is around the same time that his mother, and his mother is the one who kind of had a huge influence in his life. She's in fact there's this really beautiful painting that was in the show of this man having twins. And there's a female form that appears kind of kneeling next to him. And I found that kneeling female form in so many of his paintings. And of course, that was coming also from his interest in Srinathji and Darshan and the figure of the supplicant. But also that was the only feminine presence I found in a lot of the work. And what I realized was that there was this tension that is constantly being expressed in the subtext in a lot of the more explicit works. Bhupan was very interested in not being alienated. He spoke about that constantly. He didn't want to live he could have stayed here, but he chose to go back. He wanted to belong to his community in Baroda. His lovers were often older men, and he's kind of used these tropes of bhakti poetry and the idea of seva to explain those relationships. He was thinking in terms of love and devotion, but he was also thinking in terms of transgression, right? And so I think his way of dealing with those issues is completely his own. Initially when I looked at the research that the institution had done on You Can't Please All, which has been called his coming out painting, I realized that there was a bit of an exaggeration there. It wasn't just that he had come to Europe and suddenly found this very permissive society and then had gone home and come out of the closet. It wasn't as simple as that. It was a process in which he witnesses that change happening within his own circle of friends, and then comes back and finds his own path. And that's what he's really saying in You Can't Please All is, here's this man who's looking out off the balcony at life outside, and he very much still belongs to that world where, and there are all these clues in the painting about this kind of hidden homosocial spaces of the small town, but also that his nudity is only exposed to the audience of the painting, not to the people in the town. That nudity is still happening within the private space. So it's a very cleverly framed work. I don't know if I've answered your question.
There's one more work that maybe, because when he spoke about ambiguity, there was actually one work, and I might just get the title wrong, but it's Blind Man and Wanton Woman, or how's...
Yes.
And that one, it appears towards the end of the exhibition in the way that you stated at the Deutsche Bank Kunsthalle.
It's in My Dear Friend.
Yeah, and in fact, when doing a sort of guided tour, that particular work really stayed with me, and I kind of tried, in place of you at that point, to temporarily talk about it, because it's actually reversing this kind of relationship with desire, with what is illicit, with the inside and the outside, because there's the window,
public and private space.
Yeah, the man and the woman are inside. The woman is the one whose body is exposed. The man is blind, and yet outside, from the window, you see with the
Venetian blinds,
yeah,
and you can see drunk men at a liquor store.
Yeah, but also scenes of like sex, and there's various scenes taking place almost in a sort of miniature style, right?
Yeah. It was really interesting to read his stories in relation to these works, because the stories are really all about, middle class hypocrisy, right? It's about people living in chawls having really sordid affairs. It's really about, India changing at that point. So there's a really great story called Foreign Soap, which is about coveting these imported goods. And even in that, there is this idea of salvation. Um, there is this deep understanding of everyday spirituality. I was told that his last lover, Vallabhbhai, was a practicing Vaishnavite who would go to these satsangs, and Bhupan would go with him. And, known or unknown, they were totally accepted in that space. And so this idea of sort of transgressing, but then also asking forgiveness just in case, which is very everyday practice in South Asia, was something that he brought in to that narrative.
And also that the everyday spaces, like by the shopkeeper, or even he talks at some point about funerals, and how there's a certain sociality around meeting men at all kinds of places,
Yeah,
right? I mean, in a way, it's
exactly.
quite
So and the temple, the mosque,
Yeah.
the barber shop, the chai shop. I mean, these are all places where he met people,
and again where the
or
sexuality
at least
would have
admired
played
people.
out.
I mean, there's a great story that I think Nilima Sheikh told me about him gate crashing funerals,
Exactly, that's what I was
where he
talking
would
about.
where he would go to the funerals of strangers. Um, and that one day apparently he was caught out because he didn't know if the deceased was a man or a woman. And somebody said, why are you here?
Hi, Nada. I just
Hi.
wanted to add one small thing. Bhupen's books, the ones that he illustrated with prints, I
Mm-hmm.
haven't seen. Was the books included in this exhibition? Any of the books?
They were. So in the vitrine that I showed, there was a copy of Foreign Soap,
Okay.
which was printed in English. So we had, it was done in Gujarati and in English. Which is a really beautiful edition, and we were lucky that there were editions available here. We had a copy, as I said, of the woodcuts that he did for the Salman Rushdie. It was a book called Two Stories, and it's actually fantastic because in Two Stories is a story called The Prophet's Hair, which is about the disappearance of the Prophet's hair from the Hazrat Bal Mosque in Kashmir. I mean, there were so many, extraordinary, again, conversations I had with quite important literary figures through Bhupen. There were he painted portraits of Salman Rushdie, and I got to go to Salman's house in New York and spend time and look at the works in his collection. We borrowed all of them. Um, and he was recollecting the conversations they would have, and there's definitely something there which again could be developed about what they were both doing vis-a-vis spirituality, and the fact that you could do it then and you can't do it now. And I'm sure that the Rushdie affair, as well as what happens to Hussain, are reasons why Bhupen's work becomes slightly more, people become more cautious around it. Going back to the prints and drawings, we, like I said, we also showed a spread from Vishchik, a woodcut that Bhupen had done. And we also, in the vitrine, showed these accordion books that he had painted, which are very beautifully detailed. And if you can get a copy of the catalog, and if you can't, please ask me and I'll try and get one to you. We've reproduced some of them.
Yeah. I also wanted to share a small thing. Was that Bollywood was very much a part of Bhupen's work. I remember having
Bollywood, yes.
Bollywood. I remember visiting his
Yeah.
studio once, and he was working on a very large watercolor, and there was a film running with the song and dance sequences going on, and he was having a fabulous time with the painting as well as the song.
Yeah, apparently, Apparently, he loved to sing Bollywood songs. I mean, I really wish I had met him. I think that would have been, that would have been the really fun part.
Thank you so much, Nada, for joining
No
us.
questions about the missing, any questions about the missing one, or was that self-explanatory?
We've unfortunately run out of time, but we could
Okay,
address
thank
it
you.
together tomorrow.
All right. So I look forward to seeing you guys then, and I'll be following the proceedings for the rest of the day virtually. So thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you, Nada.